The greatest case of mistaken identity. Every morning you wake up with an unquestioned certainty about who you are. You have a name, a history, preferences, fears, dreams, and an intricate web of relationships that seem to define your very essence. You look in the mirror and recognize yourself, that familiar face staring back, accompanied by the inner narrator that never seems to stop commenting on your life. This sense of being a separate, distinct individual navigating through an external world appears so obvious, so fundamental to your experience, that questioning it might seem absurd. Yet what if this most basic assumption about your existence, that you are who you think you are, is actually the greatest case of mistaken identity in human experience? What if the very sense of being a separate self, an isolated island of consciousness in an ocean of otherness, is nothing more than an elaborate mental construction, a convincing illusion that creates the majority of human suffering? This inquiry into the nature of identity is not merely philosophical speculation. It strikes at the heart of every moment of dissatisfaction, every feeling of incompleteness, every struggle with anxiety, depression, and the endless search for meaning and fulfillment. The separate self, this seemingly solid entity you take yourself to be, may be the phantom behind all psychological suffering, a ghost in the machine of consciousness that haunts your peace with its constant demands, fears, and insatiable hunger for more. The exploration we're about to undertake requires a willingness to question everything you've taken for granted about yourself. It demands that you look beyond the surface narrative of your life and examine the very foundation upon which your sense of identity rests. This is not an intellectual exercise designed to impress with clever concepts, but a direct investigation into the nature of your immediate, lived experience, the architecture of the illusory self, the birth of separation. To understand why you are not who you think you are, we must first examine how this sense of separate selfhood arises. From the moment of birth, perhaps even before, the human organism begins the process of creating boundaries. The infant learns to distinguish between self and other, between internal sensations and external stimuli. This differentiation is necessary for survival. Knowing where you end and the world begins allows for navigation, protection, and the fulfillment of basic needs. However, what begins as a practical survival mechanism gradually solidifies into something far more complex and problematic. The growing child doesn't just learn to distinguish between self and other. They begin to construct an elaborate identity around this distinction. They internalize the names given to them, the roles assigned, the expectations placed upon them. They develop preferences, aversions, beliefs, and values that seem to define who they are. Consider Sarah, a 35-year-old marketing executive. When asked to describe herself, she might say, "I'm a creative person who loves coffee, hates confrontation, and dreams of writing a novel someday. I'm the eldest daughter in my family, which made me responsible and perfectionist. I'm someone who values honesty and loyalty above all else." Each of these descriptors seems to point to an essential Sarah, a core identity that remains consistent over time. But let's examine this more closely. Sarah's love of coffee. Is this truly fundamental to who she is? What if she developed a medical condition that required her to give up caffeine entirely? Would she cease to be Sarah? Her role as the eldest daughter? This is simply a circumstantial fact of birth order. Had her parents had children in a different sequence, this defining characteristic would be entirely different. Her fear of confrontation. Countless people have overcome such fears through therapy, life experience, or simple maturation. Are we to believe that Sarah's essential identity shifts when her psychological patterns change? The storytelling mind. The human mind is fundamentally a storytelling device. It takes the continuous flow of experience, sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, and weaves them into a coherent narrative. This narrative function serves important purposes. It helps make sense of experience, creates predictability, and allows for planning and learning from the past. However, this same storytelling capacity becomes the architect of the separate self. Every day, your mind constructs and reinforces the story of you. It selects certain experiences as significant and discards others as irrelevant. It connects dots between past and present, creating themes and patterns that seem to reveal your true nature. It projects into the future, imagining scenarios where this character called you will act, achieve, or suffer. Take Michael, a 42-year-old teacher who considers himself naturally shy. This identity seems supported by a wealth of evidence. He remembers being quiet as a child, preferring books to social gatherings, feeling nervous before public speaking. His mind has woven these experiences into a coherent story. I am a shy person. This story then becomes self-reinforcing. Because Michael believes he is shy, he avoids social situations, which provides more evidence of his shyness, which strengthens the story, which leads to more avoidance. But what if we examine Michael's experience more closely? There are countless moments when he isn't shy at all, when he's passionate about his subject matter and speaks animatedly to his students, when he's helping a friend in need and forgets all self-consciousness, when he's alone in nature and feels completely at ease with himself. The mind, in its storytelling function, dismisses these experiences as exceptions to the rule rather than recognizing them as evidence that shyness is not a fixed identity, but merely a conditional response that arises under certain circumstances. The museum of me. Your sense of self is like a personal museum, carefully curated with artifacts from your past. Each memory, each defining moment, each triumph and trauma is preserved and displayed as evidence of who you are. You are the curator of this museum, deciding which experiences deserve prominent placement and which should be relegated to storage. But museums, no matter how carefully maintained, are static representations of dynamic realities. The person who experienced those formative moments no longer exists, not in any literal sense. The cells in your body have largely replaced themselves multiple times over. Your knowledge, perspectives, and understanding have evolved. Even your memories of those defining experiences have been altered each time you've recalled them, influenced by your current state of mind and accumulated wisdom. Consider Jennifer, who defines herself largely through a traumatic breakup she experienced 5 years ago. In her personal museum, this event occupies a central position. I'm someone who's been deeply hurt, she tells herself and others. I have trust issues because of what happened. The breakup becomes not just something that happened to Jennifer, but something that defines who Jennifer is. Yet if we look closely, we find that Jennifer's daily experience is far richer and more varied than this singular defining story suggests. She experiences moments of joy, creativity, generosity, and connection that have nothing to do with that past relationship. She demonstrates trust in countless small ways, trusting her car to start, trusting her friends to keep their word, trusting that the sun will rise tomorrow. But because these experiences don't fit the central narrative of her museum, they're either ignored or interpreted through the lens of her defining story. The mechanisms of suffering, the hungry ghost of identity, the separate self, once constructed, becomes like a hungry ghost, always seeking, never satisfied. This phantom entity you take yourself to be has an insatiable appetite for validation, security, pleasure, and meaning. It constantly seeks experiences and achievements that will confirm its existence, strengthen its boundaries, and feed its sense of importance. Consider David, a successful lawyer who worked tirelessly to achieve his current position. He thought that reaching partnership at his firm would finally give him the satisfaction and security he craved. Yet within months of achieving this goal, the same restless hunger returned. Now he needs a bigger house, a more prestigious case, recognition from his peers. Each achievement provides only temporary satisfaction before the hungry ghost of his separate self demands more. This insatiable hunger is not a character flaw or a sign of greed. It's the inevitable result of trying to feed something that doesn't actually exist. The separate self is like a mirage. No matter how much water you pour toward it, it remains thirsty because there's nothing there to drink. Every attempt to satisfy the separate self is doomed to fail because you're trying to nourish an illusion. The tragedy is not just that this quest is futile, but that it prevents recognition of what is already present. David's natural state of contentment, his inherent completeness, is constantly overlooked in favor of the next achievement that might finally prove his worth. He's like someone dying of thirst while standing in a crystal-clear lake, convinced that water exists only in the mirage shimmering on the horizon. The prison of comparison. One of the most insidious aspects of the separate self is how it creates its identity through comparison and contrast. You know yourself as tall only in relation to others who are short, as successful only in comparison to those who are unsuccessful. This relational nature of identity means that your sense of self is constantly dependent on external references, making it inherently unstable and vulnerable. Maria, a talented artist, experiences this acutely. When she views her work in isolation, she often feels satisfied and inspired. But the moment she compares her paintings to those of other artists, whether more or less accomplished, her sense of self begins to fluctuate wildly. She becomes either inflated with pride or deflated with inadequacy, depending on the comparison. Her actual artistic ability hasn't changed, but her identity as an artist, her sense of who she is, becomes a roller coaster ride dependent on external validation and comparative assessment. This comparative nature of identity creates a prison of constant evaluation. You cannot simply exist. You must constantly measure yourself against others, against your past self, against your idealized future self. This comparison trap generates endless suffering because it's based on the false premise that your worth or identity depends on where you stand relative to others in some imaginary hierarchy. The burden of maintenance. Perhaps most exhausting of all is the constant energy required to maintain the separate self. Like a house of cards built in a windstorm, the constructed identity requires continuous reinforcement and protection. You must remember to act consistently with your self-image, defend your beliefs and preferences, protect your reputation, and ensure that your actions align with who you think you are. Robert, who prides himself on being the reliable one in his family and friend group, experiences this burden acutely. He cannot simply respond naturally to requests for help. He must always say yes, even when he's overwhelmed or exhausted, because refusing would contradict his carefully maintained identity. The spontaneous no that might arise naturally is suppressed in favor of maintaining the image of reliability. Over time, this constant self-editing and identity maintenance becomes exhausting, leading to resentment and burnout. The separate self must also defend itself against contradictory evidence. When Robert occasionally fails to follow through on a commitment, he experiences intense shame and self-criticism because this failure threatens his core identity. He might make excuses, rationalize his behavior, or promise to do better next time, all in service of maintaining the illusion that there is a consistent, reliable Robert who occasionally fails, rather than recognizing that reliability and unreliability are simply different expressions arising naturally in different circumstances. Daily life examples. The illusion in action. The morning mirror. Ritual. Let's examine one of the most mundane yet revealing daily experiences. Looking in the mirror. For most people, this simple act triggers an immediate cascade of identity reinforcement. You see the familiar face and automatically think, "That's me." But what exactly are you identifying with? The physical features you recognize have changed dramatically over the years. The face that looked back at you 10 years ago was noticeably different, and the face that will look back 10 years from now will be different still. Which of these faces is the real you? Moreover, the body you're identifying with is in constant flux. Cells dying and regenerating, weight fluctuating, expressions changing based on mood and circumstance. Yet even more revealing is what happens next. For many people, the morning mirror triggers a stream of judgments and evaluations. I look tired today. My hair is a mess. I'm looking older. I need to lose weight. Notice that these thoughts assume the existence of someone separate from the reflection who is evaluating and judging it. But who is this judge? Can you find this evaluator when you look for it directly? Susan, a 45-year-old mother of two, has struggled with her appearance since her teenage years. Every morning, her mirror encounter becomes a battleground where she wages war with her reflection. She sees lines around her eyes and interprets them as evidence of aging and decline. She notices the weight she's gained since having children and feels ashamed of her lack of discipline. The woman in the mirror becomes both herself and her enemy. the source of her identity and her suffering. But what if Susan could see that the judgment and the judged are both appearances in the same mirror of consciousness? What if the critic who finds fault with the reflection is itself just another thought arising in awareness, no more solid or permanent than the physical features it judges? The suffering comes not from the appearance itself, but from the false division between the seer and the seen, the judge and the judged. The traffic jam revelation. Consider something as ordinary as being stuck in traffic. For most people, this situation triggers an immediate response: frustration, impatience, anger at other drivers, anxiety about being late. But let's examine what's actually happening beneath these surface reactions. The separate self interprets the traffic jam as an obstacle to its plans, a threat to its schedule, an affront to its importance. I'm going to be late, it thinks. This always happens to me. I don't have time for this. Notice how each of these thoughts reinforces the sense of being a separate entity with its own agenda, fighting against a world that doesn't cooperate with its desires. Tom, a sales manager, experiences this daily during his commute. When traffic is flowing smoothly, he feels relatively peaceful. When he hits congestion, he becomes tense and irritated. His mood, his sense of well-being, even his identity as someone who has his act together, all depend on external circumstances completely beyond his control. He's given his peace away to traffic patterns. But what if Tom could recognize that the experience of sitting in traffic, the sensations in his body, the sounds around him, even the arising of frustration, is simply what's happening right now? What if he could see that the separate self that claims ownership of this experience, I'm stuck, I'm late, I'm frustrated, is itself just another arising in the same field of awareness that contains the cars, the sounds, and the bodily sensations? The traffic hasn't changed, but the framework for interpreting the experience has shifted dramatically. Instead of being a separate self battling against circumstances, there's simply traffic happening, sensations happening, thoughts happening, all arising in the same open space of awareness without anyone separate standing apart from it. The social media mirror. Perhaps no modern phenomenon reveals the constructed nature of identity more clearly than social media. Platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn have become digital mirrors in which people continuously construct and present curated versions of themselves. The gap between who you think you are and who you present yourself to be online often reveals the artificial nature of identity itself. Lisa, a freelance photographer, carefully curates her Instagram feed to present herself as someone living an enviable creative life. She posts only her best work, her most photogenic meals, her most inspiring moments. Over time, even she begins to believe this curated version is who she really is. When her actual daily experience doesn't match her online persona, when she feels uninspired, eats junk food, or struggles with self-doubt, she experiences a painful disconnect. This disconnect reveals something profound. If you can consciously construct a version of yourself for public consumption, how can any version be the real you? The Instagram Lisa is clearly a construction, but so is the authentic Lisa, who feels disappointed when her real life doesn't match her online image. Both are stories. Both are constructions of the storytelling mind. Even more revealing is what happens when Lisa receives likes, comments, and follows. Each notification triggers a small burst of validation, confirming the existence and worth of the constructed self. But this validation is inherently unstable. It depends entirely on external feedback from strangers about a curated version of a constructed identity. The whole system is like a hall of mirrors with reflections reflecting reflections, but no solid reality at the center. The career identity crisis. Professional identity often provides one of the strongest pillars supporting the sense of separate selfhood. When someone asks, "What do you do?" the question is rarely about your current activity but about your professional identity. The answer, "I'm a teacher, I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor," seems to reveal something essential about who you are. Mark spent 20 years building his identity as a successful investment banker. His sense of worth, his social status, even his understanding of his own character were all intertwined with his professional success. When the 2008 financial crisis forced him into early retirement, he experienced what he could only describe as an identity crisis. Without his professional role, he felt lost, purposeless, unsure of who he was. But Mark's crisis reveals something important. If his identity as a banker could disappear through external circumstances, was it ever really who he was? The skills, knowledge, and experience he gained during his banking career didn't vanish, but the identity built around those skills proved to be as ephemeral as morning mist. During his period of unemployment, Mark had the opportunity to discover aspects of himself that had been overshadowed by his professional identity. He found he enjoyed cooking, had a talent for mentoring young people, and experienced deep satisfaction in volunteer work. Were these qualities not him during his banking years? Or was the banker identity simply one possible expression among many? The crisis forced Mark to confront a fundamental question. If he could lose his professional identity and discover new aspects of himself, who was the constant presence that remained throughout all these changes? Who was aware of being a banker, then of not being a banker, then of being a volunteer and mentor? The relationship mirror. Romantic relationships often serve as powerful mirrors that reflect and challenge identity. The way you understand yourself shifts dramatically based on who you're with and how they see you. This relational nature of identity reveals its constructed character. Jennifer thought she was a patient, nurturing person until she entered a relationship with someone whose habits triggered constant irritation in her. Suddenly, she found herself snapping at her partner, feeling resentful, and questioning her own character. "This isn't who I am," she told herself, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Was the patient Jennifer the real one, or was the irritated Jennifer more authentic? The confusion arose from taking either version as a fixed identity. In reality, both patience and irritation are natural responses that arise under different circumstances. There's no fixed Jennifer who is either patient or impatient. There are simply different qualities expressing themselves as different situations call them forth. The suffering came from trying to maintain a consistent identity, rather than allowing natural responsiveness to flow freely. Even more revealing is what happens when relationships end. People often describe breakups as losing themselves or not knowing who they are anymore. But if your identity can be lost when a relationship ends, was it ever truly yours? The identity that seemed so solid when reflected in your partner's eyes proves to be as dependent and conditional as any other construction. The neuroscience of the constructed self. The default mode network. Modern neuroscience has begun to illuminate the mechanisms by which the brain constructs and maintains the sense of separate selfhood. The default mode network, DMN, a network of brain regions that becomes active during rest and introspection, appears to be heavily involved in self-referential thinking, the constant mental chatter that maintains the story of me. When people report experiences of ego dissolution or selflessness, whether through meditation, psychedelic experiences, or simply moments of deep absorption in activity, brain imaging often shows decreased activity in the DMN. This suggests that the sense of separate selfhood is not a fundamental feature of consciousness, but rather an overlay produced by specific neural activity. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's research on psychedelics has shown that substances like psilocybin and LSD reduce activity in the DMN while simultaneously increasing connectivity between normally separate brain networks. Participants often report experiences of unity, interconnectedness, and the dissolution of the boundary between self and world. These experiences suggest that the separate self is indeed a construction that can be temporarily suspended, revealing more fundamental states of consciousness. The storytelling brain. The brain's left hemisphere, particularly areas involved in language processing, appears to play a crucial role in creating the narrative self. This interpreter function continuously weaves experience into coherent stories, even when those stories require significant distortion of actual events. Split-brain patients whose corpus callosum has been severed to treat severe epilepsy provide fascinating insights into this storytelling function. When information is presented only to the right hemisphere, which has limited language capacity, patients cannot verbally report what they've seen. However, the left hemisphere will often confabulate elaborate explanations for behaviors initiated by the right hemisphere. creating stories to maintain narrative coherence even when it has no actual information about the cause of the behavior. This reveals something profound about normal brain function. The storytelling mechanism operates continuously, creating explanations and narratives even when it lacks complete information. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do may be far more fictional than we realize, constructed by a brain system designed to maintain narrative coherence rather than accurately represent reality. Neuroplasticity and identity. The discovery of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and form new neural connections throughout life, further undermines the notion of fixed identity. If your brain is constantly changing, adapting and reorganizing itself based on experience, thought patterns, and even focused attention, then any identity based on neurological patterns is inherently fluid and changeable. Meditation practitioners show measurable changes in brain structure after relatively short periods of practice. Areas associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-awareness become more developed, while areas associated with the default mode network often show decreased activity. These changes correspond with reported shifts in identity and self-perception, suggesting that who you think you are is far more malleable than typically assumed. Philosophical investigations. The observer and the observed. One of the most direct ways to investigate the nature of identity is to examine the relationship between the observer and the observed. In any moment of experience, there appears to be someone who is aware and something of which they are aware. You might be aware of thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, or even the sense of being aware itself. But when you look for this observer, this one who is supposedly aware, what do you actually find? Can you locate the observer as an object of experience? When you search for the one who is looking, you might find thoughts about yourself, memories, images, or concepts. But can you find the actual observer as anything separate from the field of awareness itself? This investigation often reveals something surprising. The observer cannot be found as an object because it is the very capacity for objects to appear. It's like trying to see your own eyes. You can see reflections of them, representations of them, but never the eyes themselves as objects in your visual field, because they are the very capacity for vision. Consider this carefully in your own experience right now. You are aware of these words, but can you find the you that is aware as something separate from the awareness in which the words appear? You might find thoughts about yourself, but these thoughts are also objects appearing in awareness. The supposed reader of these words cannot be found as an object of experience because it is the very space in which all objects appear. The persistence of identity. Another avenue of investigation involves examining the supposed continuity of identity over time. You likely have a strong sense that you are the same person who went to sleep last night and woke up this morning, the same person who experienced childhood, adolescence, and whatever life experiences have brought you to this moment. But what exactly persists to create this continuity? It's not your body, which is in constant flux. It's not your thoughts, which are different from moment to moment. It's not your emotions, which change based on circumstances. It's not your memories, which are selective, imperfect, and constantly being updated. It's not your preferences, which evolve over time. What exactly remains constant enough to justify the sense of being the same person over time? Many people point to consciousness itself as the continuous element, but even this requires careful examination. The consciousness present when you're deeply asleep appears quite different from waking consciousness. The consciousness present when you're absorbed in an activity seems different from the self-conscious awareness present when you're thinking about yourself. Which of these states represents the real you? Perhaps the search for continuity itself is misguided. What if identity doesn't persist over time but is freshly constructed in each moment based on memory, habit, and circumstance? What if the sense of being the same person is simply another story created by the mind to maintain coherence and predictability? The boundary problem. Where exactly do you begin and end? This seemingly simple question reveals the arbitrary nature of identity boundaries. Your thoughts arise spontaneously from unknown sources. Do they belong to you or do you belong to them? Your emotions often seem to have lives of their own. arising and passing away without your control or permission. Your body functions through processes completely outside your conscious direction. The air you breathe becomes part of your body with each inhalation and returns to the environment with each exhalation. The food you eat becomes your flesh and blood before being eliminated as waste. The photons entering your eyes become the visual experience you call seeing the world. Where in this continuous exchange of energy and matter does you begin and not you end? Even more fundamentally, what you call your individual consciousness appears to be inseparable from the consciousness in which all experience arises. The awareness that knows your thoughts is the same awareness that knows the sounds around you, the sensations in your body, and the visual perceptions appearing now. This awareness doesn't seem to have personal boundaries. It simply is, containing all experience without being limited to any particular content, the liberation of seeing through what remains. When the self dissolves. When the constructed nature of the separate self is clearly seen, a common fear arises. If I'm not who I think I am, then who am I? If there's no separate self, what remains? This fear reflects the assumption that without the constructed identity, there would be nothing, a kind of psychological annihilation. But experience reveals something quite different. When the separate self is seen through, what remains is not nothing but everything. The awareness that was always present becomes recognized as your true nature, not as a possession of a separate self, but as the very foundation of all experience. This awareness is not personal. It's the open space in which all personal experience appears. Sarah, whom we met earlier as the marketing executive defining herself through various characteristics, had a profound shift during a period of intense meditation retreat. For a moment, the entire construction of Sarah simply dissolved. There was no one to be creative or uncreative, no one to love or hate coffee, no one to be responsible or irresponsible. Yet rather than experiencing annihilation, there was an overwhelming sense of freedom and completeness. Everything was still present: thoughts, sensations, perceptions, but there was no separate someone claiming ownership of the experience. In this recognition, Sarah realized that she had never actually been the limited character she took herself to be. That character was simply one possible expression, arising in the limitless space of awareness that was her true nature. The marketing executive could still appear when circumstances called for that expression, but she was no longer trapped within that identity or exhausted by the effort of maintaining it. The end of seeking. One of the most profound shifts that occurs when the illusory nature of the separate self is recognized is the natural end of seeking. The hungry ghost that was constantly searching for satisfaction, meaning, and completion is revealed to have been a phantom all along. What was being sought was already present, not as an acquisition of the separate self, but as the very nature of what you are. This doesn't mean that preferences disappear or that you become passive. Rather, activity arises naturally without the driving compulsion of the separate self, trying to get somewhere or become something. There might still be goals and achievements, but they're no longer burdened with the weight of identity formation or self-validation. Michael, the teacher who identified as naturally shy, experienced this shift during a particularly challenging period in his life when his carefully maintained identity simply couldn't be sustained any longer. In the exhaustion of trying to maintain his story about himself, something gave way. He found himself speaking authentically in situations where the shy Michael would have remained silent, not through forced effort, but through a natural responsiveness to what each moment required. The shyness and outgoingness were both seen as natural expressions that could arise as needed, neither defining nor limiting his essential nature. He could be quiet when quietness was appropriate, and expressive when expression was called for, without either state threatening his sense of identity. Natural functioning. When the separate self is seen through, what emerges is what might be called natural functioning. Response without the intermediary of a separate responder. Life continues perhaps more smoothly than before, but without the constant friction of a separate self trying to control, manage, and direct experience according to its preferences and fears. This natural functioning often appears as increased spontaneity, creativity, and appropriateness of response. Without the filter of identity maintenance, responses arise more directly from the wholeness of the situation rather than from the limited perspective of a separate character. It's like the difference between a river flowing naturally toward the sea and water being channeled through a complex system of pipes and valves. Both reach their destination, but one flows with much less resistance and effort. Jennifer, who had defined herself through her past trauma, found that when this identity dissolved, her natural capacity for trust and openness began to express itself without the constant vigilance of self-protection. This didn't mean she became naive or careless, but rather that her responses to people and situations arose from present moment awareness rather than from past conditioning and story. The trust issues that had seemed so central to her identity were revealed to be just one possible response pattern that could arise when circumstances warranted, but they no longer defined her or limited her capacity for fresh response in each new moment. Living the understanding integration in daily life. Understanding the illusory nature of the separate self intellectually is one thing. Living from this understanding in daily life is another. The momentum of lifelong conditioning continues, and the separate self can seem to reassert itself, especially during times of stress, conflict, or strong emotion. This is completely natural and doesn't indicate failure or lack of understanding. The key is gentle recognition rather than resistance. When you notice the separate self asserting itself through defensiveness, comparison, seeking, or any other familiar pattern, this noticing itself is already a step outside the illusion. You don't have to fight the separate self or try to maintain some special state of selflessness. Simply recognizing the construction as it arises naturally weakens its hold. Robert, who had exhausted himself trying to maintain his identity as the reliable one, found that even after recognizing the constructed nature of this identity, the old patterns would still arise, especially when family members made requests. But now, instead of automatically saying yes or feeling guilty about saying no, there was a pause, a space of recognition in which the pattern could be seen as it arose. Sometimes he would still say yes, but now it came from genuine availability rather than identity maintenance. Sometimes he would say no, without the elaborate justifications that had previously been necessary to protect his self-image. The understanding doesn't eliminate all conditioning overnight, but it provides the space of awareness in which conditioning can be seen clearly and responded to consciously rather than unconsciously enacted. Relationships without the separate self. One of the most beautiful transformations that can occur when the separate self is seen through is in the realm of relationships. When there's no separate self to defend, promote, or maintain, relating becomes much more natural and intimate. The barriers that seem to separate you from others are revealed to be constructions that were never actually there. This doesn't mean boundaries disappear or that you become merged with others in some unhealthy way. Rather, boundaries become functional rather than defensive. You can still maintain privacy, make choices about how to spend your time and energy, and respond to others from clarity rather than reactivity. But these responses arise from wisdom and appropriateness rather than from the fears and desires of a separate self. Maria, the artist who had suffered from constant comparison with others, found that when her separate artistic identity dissolved, she could appreciate other artists' work without it triggering either jealousy or superiority. The work could simply be appreciated for what it was, without any reference to a separate Maria, who might be threatened or inflated by the comparison. This allowed for much more genuine connection with other artists and a natural collaboration that had been impossible when she was protecting and promoting her artistic identity. In intimate relationships, the absence of a separate self to defend or promote allows for unprecedented authenticity and vulnerability. You can be present with your partner's experience without immediately referencing it back to your own story or identity. Their joy doesn't need to become your joy, their pain doesn't need to become your pain, but both can be met with open presence, without the barrier of separation. Work and career. Without identity, professional life can continue and even flourish when it's no longer burdened with identity formation and maintenance. Skills, knowledge, and experience don't disappear when the separate self is seen through. If anything, They can be expressed more freely without the self-consciousness that comes from constantly monitoring and protecting a professional image. Mark, the former investment banker, eventually found work as a financial consultant, but his relationship to his professional role was entirely different. The work was simply what was happening, not who he was. He could engage fully with clients and projects without the underlying anxiety about maintaining his professional identity, or the constant calculation of how each interaction might affect his reputation or advancement. This shift often leads to increased effectiveness and satisfaction in work. Without the energy drain of identity maintenance, more attention is available for the actual tasks at hand. Decision-making becomes clearer because it's no longer filtered through the lens of, "What would someone like me do?" or "How will this affect my image?" Instead, responses arise naturally from the intelligence and experience that are present, without the interference of a separate self trying to manage the outcome. Creative expression often flourishes when freed from the burden of personal identity. The artist no longer needs to create their art or maintain their style. Instead, creativity can flow naturally through them without the constraint of having to confirm or express a particular identity. This often leads to more authentic and varied expression, as the creative force is no longer channeled through the narrow funnel of a separate self's preferences and fears. Conclusion: the pathless path. The recognition that you are not who you think you are is not the end of a spiritual journey, but rather the beginning of authentic living. It's the dissolution of a fundamental misconception that has been the source of most psychological suffering. Yet this recognition doesn't lead to a nihilistic void or the elimination of human experience. Instead, it reveals the fullness that was always present but obscured by the drama of the separate self. This understanding cannot be achieved through effort or practice, because effort and practice imply a separate someone trying to get somewhere. Rather, it's a recognition that can dawn at any moment when the mind's construction activity is seen clearly. Sometimes this recognition comes through intense seeking that eventually exhausts itself. Sometimes it arises spontaneously in moments of ordinariness. Sometimes it emerges gradually as the stories we tell ourselves slowly lose their convincing power. The pathless path is the recognition that there was never anywhere to go, and no one to make the journey. What you are seeking, you already are. Who you truly are was never the limited character you took yourself to be, but the very awareness in which that character appeared. This awareness is not personal. It doesn't belong to you. Rather, you are a temporary expression of this infinite impersonal awareness that is the ground of all experience. Living from this understanding is not about maintaining some special state or constantly reminding yourself of non-dual truths. It's about the gradual relaxation of the effort to be someone, the gentle release of the burden of maintaining and protecting an identity that was never real to begin with. The separate self may continue to make appearances, like an actor stepping onto the stage when the play requires it. But there's no longer the exhausting effort to make this character consistent, believable, or permanent. The actor can play their role fully without forgetting that they are not limited to that role. When the scene ends, they can step off stage without clinging to the character or fearing its dissolution. The practical implications: emotional freedom. When the separate self is seen through, the entire landscape of emotional experience transforms. Emotions are no longer your emotions that you must manage, control, or take responsibility for. Instead, they're recognized as natural movements within the field of awareness, arising and passing away like weather patterns in the sky. This doesn't mean emotions become less intense or that you become emotionally numb. If anything, emotions can be experienced more fully because there's no separate self trying to control or manipulate them for its own purposes. Anger can burn through completely without the separate self making it mean something about your character. Sadness can flow without the story of your tragic life. Joy can radiate without the separate self trying to capture and possess it. Lisa, the photographer whose Instagram persona had created such internal conflict, found that when the separate self dissolved, her emotions became like visitors rather than residents. Depression might visit for a while, but it was no longer her depression that said something fundamental about who she was. Creative inspiration might arrive, but it wasn't her creativity that she needed to protect and cultivate. Each emotional state was simply what was present, requiring no management or identity formation. The end of psychological time. The separate self lives primarily in psychological time, constantly referencing the past to confirm its story and projecting into the future to maintain its continuity. When this self is seen through, there's a natural settling into the present moment, not as a practice or discipline, but as the recognition that this is where life actually happens. The past becomes simply memory arising now. The future becomes simply imagination occurring now. The entire temporal structure that seemed to give the separate self its continuity is revealed to be a mental construction happening in the eternal present. This doesn't mean practical planning disappears, but it's no longer burdened with the weight of maintaining a consistent identity across time. Tom, the sales manager who had been at the mercy of traffic patterns, found that when the separate self dissolved, his entire relationship to time shifted. He could still keep appointments and maintain schedules, but there was no longer the underlying anxiety about his time being wasted or his schedule being disrupted. Time became simply what was happening now, whether that was flowing movement or stationary waiting. Authentic action. Without a separate self to maintain and protect, action becomes remarkably authentic and appropriate. Responses arise naturally from the totality of each situation, rather than being filtered through the limited perspective of a separate character trying to get something or avoid something. This doesn't mean you become passive or lose the capacity for decisive action. If anything, action becomes more effective because it's not compromised by the internal conflict between what the situation requires and what the separate self wants. There's no longer the exhausting internal negotiation between authentic response and identity maintenance. David, the lawyer whose achievements had never satisfied the hungry ghost of his separate self, found that when this identity dissolved, his work became remarkably focused and effective. He could advocate for his clients without the underlying agenda of proving his worth or maintaining his reputation. He could win cases without inflation and lose cases without deflation, because there was no separate David whose value was determined by external outcomes. Relationships as mirrors. When the separate self is seen through, relationships become mirrors that reflect the perfect appropriateness of each moment, rather than threats to a constructed identity. Other people are no longer primarily reference points for comparison or sources of validation, but expressions of the same awareness that you recognize as your true nature. This creates space for unprecedented intimacy and authenticity in relationships. Without a separate self to defend or promote, you can meet others exactly where they are without the immediate impulse to change them or use them to confirm your own story. Love becomes less about getting something from another person and more about recognizing the absence of any real separation between you and them. Jennifer, whose past trauma had created such rigid defensive patterns, found that when the separate self dissolved, her capacity for intimacy expanded dramatically. She could be present with others' pain without immediately making it about her own past hurt. She could receive love without the suspicious calculation of whether it was real or whether she deserved it. The walls that had seemed necessary for protection were revealed to be barriers to the very connection she had always sought. The paradox of effort. One of the most practical insights that emerges from seeing through the separate self is the understanding of when effort is appropriate and when it's counterproductive. The separate self tends to approach everything with effort, trying to be different, trying to get somewhere, trying to maintain and improve itself. This effort often creates the very problems it's trying to solve. When the separate self is seen through, there's a natural discrimination between functional effort and psychological effort. Functional effort is what's needed to accomplish practical tasks, learning skills, maintaining the body, creating and building. Psychological effort is the attempt to become someone or get somewhere psychologically, to fix or improve the separate self. Psychological effort always reinforces the very illusion it's trying to escape. You cannot effort your way out of the separate self because effort implies someone separate doing the efforting. The recognition of your true nature is always effortless because it's the recognition of what you already are, rather than the achievement of something new. This doesn't mean you become lazy or stop engaging with life. Rather, There's a natural efficiency that emerges when energy is no longer wasted on the impossible task of maintaining and improving a separate self. The energy that was previously consumed by internal conflict and identity maintenance becomes available for authentic engagement with life. Common misconceptions and obstacles. The spiritual ego. One of the most subtle traps that can emerge when the separate self begins to be seen through is the formation of what might be called a spiritual ego, a new identity built around spiritual insights and non-dual understanding. This spiritual identity can be even more insidious than ordinary ego because it's reinforced by genuine insights and can be defended with sophisticated spiritual concepts. The spiritual ego might manifest as a sense of superiority over those who don't get it, or as a new form of seeking where experiences of unity or ego dissolution become goals to be achieved and maintained. It might show up as spiritual bypassing, where genuine human emotions and practical concerns are dismissed as just ego or illusion. This spiritual identity is just as much a construction as any other form of separate selfhood, and it can be just as limiting and problematic. The antidote is the recognition that spiritual insights and experiences are also just appearances in awareness, no more fundamental than any other content of consciousness. The nothing trap. Another common misconception is the idea that seeing through the separate self means becoming nobody, caring about nothing, or entering some kind of void state. This misunderstanding often leads to attempts to eliminate all preferences, desires, and individual characteristics in pursuit of some imagined state of pure emptiness. But the recognition of your true nature doesn't eliminate the natural expression of life through the apparent individual. Preferences, desires, and individual characteristics continue to arise naturally. They're simply no longer mistaken for your fundamental identity. You can have preferences without being attached to them, desires without being driven by them, characteristics without being limited by them. The nothing that's recognized is not a blank void, but the no-thingness that is the source and substance of all experience. It's not the absence of everything, but the presence that makes everything possible. This recognition actually enhances appreciation for the play of individual expression rather than eliminating it. The maintenance trap. A related misconception is the idea that once the separate self is seen through, you must maintain some special state of consciousness or constantly remind yourself of non-dual truths. This turns the recognition into another form of practice or achievement, which immediately reinstates the very duality it's meant to transcend. The recognition of your true nature is not a state to be maintained, but the recognition of what never changes. You don't have to maintain being aware. Awareness is what you are. You don't have to maintain not being the separate self. The separate self was never real to begin with. The recognition might fade from explicit awareness, but what was recognized remains as the very foundation of all experience. Living from this understanding is not about maintaining enlightenment or constantly accessing non-dual states. It's about the gradual relaxation of the effort to be someone other than what you are. The gentle release of psychological resistance to what's actually happening in each moment. The ripple effects collective transformation. While the recognition of the illusory nature of the separate self is profoundly personal, its effects ripple out into collective human experience. When individuals stop defending and promoting separate identities, the conflicts that arise from competing egos naturally diminish. Families become more harmonious, workplaces become more collaborative, and communities become more cohesive. This isn't because people become passive or lose their capacity for discernment and appropriate action. Rather, conflicts that arise from wounded egos trying to protect themselves are replaced by natural differences of opinion and perspective that can be navigated with wisdom and compassion. The energy that was previously consumed by interpersonal drama becomes available for creative collaboration and mutual support. Global implications. On a larger scale, many of the world's most pressing problems, from environmental destruction to social inequality to international conflict, are rooted in the assumption of separation. When individuals and groups operate from the belief that they are fundamentally separate from others and from the natural world, competition and exploitation seem not only justified, but necessary for survival. The recognition that separation is illusory doesn't immediately solve these complex problems, but it provides the foundation for solutions that are based on wisdom rather than fear, cooperation rather than competition, and long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. When the separate self is seen through, the welfare of the whole naturally becomes as important as the welfare of the apparent part. The evolution of consciousness. The growing recognition of the illusory nature of the separate self may represent a natural evolution in human consciousness. Just as humanity has evolved from tribal identities to national identities to global awareness, the recognition of our fundamental unity might be the next step in this progression. This evolution doesn't require everyone to have dramatic spiritual experiences or formal non-dual understanding. It can happen gradually as the obvious suffering created by the separate self becomes clear, and as the benefits of more inclusive and compassionate ways of being become apparent. The rigid boundaries that seemed so necessary for survival in earlier stages of human development may be naturally softening as humanity matures. Final reflections. The ordinary extraordinary. The recognition that you are not who you think you are is simultaneously the most profound realization possible and the most ordinary truth of your everyday experience. It's extraordinary because it transforms your entire relationship to existence, dissolving the source of most psychological suffering and revealing the inherent completeness that was always present. It's ordinary because it's not the achievement of something new, but the recognition of what has always been true. This recognition doesn't make you special or elevated above others. If anything, it reveals the ordinary perfection of human experience exactly as it is. The separate self that seemed so important and problematic is revealed to be just another appearance in the field of awareness, no more significant than clouds passing through the sky or waves arising in the ocean. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Washing dishes becomes as profound as any spiritual experience because it's recognized as the same awareness expressing itself through different forms. Sitting in traffic becomes as meaningful as sitting in meditation because both are revealed to be perfect expressions of what you are. The search for meaning, purpose, and identity that had driven the separate self comes to a natural end. Not because these things are found, but because they're recognized as unnecessary. What you are is already meaningful, purposeful, and complete. The meaning is not something you have, but something you are. The purpose is not something you achieve, but something you express. The identity is not something you construct, but something you recognize. In this recognition, life continues much as it did before, but without the burden of someone trying to live it. Experiences arise and pass away. Challenges are met and resolved. Joys are celebrated and sorrows are mourned. But all of this happens within the space of what you are rather than to someone separate from it. The question, "Who am I?" reveals itself to have been the wrong question all along. The right question is, "What am I?" And the answer is always the same. You are the awareness in which all experience appears, the consciousness that knows all states, the presence that is equally present in all moments. You are not a thing, but the no-thingness from which all things arise and to which they return. This is not a philosophical position or a spiritual belief, but the most intimate truth of your immediate experience. It's available for recognition in this very moment, not as an achievement or attainment, but as the simple acknowledgement of what is already undeniably present. The one who would recognize this truth is revealed to be the truth itself, playing at being separate for the sheer joy of recognizing its own nature. In the end, the greatest joke is that there was never anyone who was confused about their identity, and no one who becomes enlightened to their true nature. There is only the one reality playing all the roles, the one consciousness expressing itself as the multiplicity of experience, the one awareness dreaming itself as the many and then awakening to its own nature. You are not who you think you are. You are so much more than that and so much less. You are everything and nothing, everyone and no one, the eternal and the ephemeral, the seeker and the sought, the question and the answer. You are what you have always been, what you will always be, and what you could never not be. This is the end of the search and the beginning of living. This is the death of the separate self and the birth of authentic being. This is the recognition that transforms everything by changing nothing, that solves all problems by revealing there was never anyone separate to have problems, that fulfills all desires by recognizing what never needed anything to be complete. Welcome home to what you are. You never left, but welcome home nonetheless.